We're here with Dermot Foley from VanCity Investment Management in Vancouver, BC. Dermot, most of us back east tend to think of VanCity as the Vancouver City Credit Union. Can you just quickly tell us how VanCity Investment Management ties in with the actual credit union?
Yeah, we're a subsidiary of VanCity, and one of the roles we have is we are a sub-advisor to the IA Clarington Enhanced Socially Responsible Investing Funds. And what that means is we make the day-to-day decisions as to what goes into those funds, and they're the fund tech, the manager is IA Clarington, and so they're a national mutual fund company, and so the funds that we sub-advise on are available across the country. We have three core funds: a monthly income fund, a Canadian equity fund, and a global fund. And those funds then make up packages of balanced products. So there's an IA Clarington balanced SRI fund, a growth SRI fund, and a conservative. And those funds are then matched with the IA Clarington bond fund. And so for each of those funds, we went through a process recently of reviewing our fossil fuel exposure within those funds and came to some interesting conclusions. In particular, we realized that the long-term price of oil and gas is actually, right now, it's at its average long-term price. So a lot of people now recognize that the extremely high prices we saw were really an anomaly. And so they more or less returned to the mean. And when we look back at the performance, the financial performance of those companies within the market, essentially they're back to where they were 5 years ago. And so there is no real gain to the mutual fund holder from owning those for 5 years. So that'll look much deeper at, well, what are the other risks associated with fossil fuel companies? And from that, we decided that we could eliminate all of the oil sands from our Canadian equity fund, mainly because of the high costs, the high production costs. We also eliminated them from our monthly income fund, and we eliminated all fossil fuel companies from our global equity fund. So there's like three different funds, and a slightly different approach to each one. Mainly, when we were, as we were approaching this, we were thinking about climate risk and all the different aspects of climate risks that are going to become more prominent over the next few years.
Okay, I did want to ask you more about the way you'd define the risk profile, but before we go there, how does a fossil-free mutual fund tie in with VanCity's mission as a financial institution? In some of the coverage, particularly in the Vancouver Sun, we saw a colleague of yours saying that members have been asking for this for some time, and that it was a matter of protecting their portfolios, but also following their heart. Can you tell me about that?
Most people don't realize, but VanCity started the first socially responsible mutual fund in Canada in 1985. So VanCity's always been responsive to its members' needs and willing to take steps in pioneering investment products. So in a sense, it's a natural for VanCity to be one of the first companies in Canada to publicly declare they're going to have a fossil fuel-free mutual fund. So
Okay.
it's partly in response to members, but for us, it was really a convergence of the the change in price of oil and gas companies, the emerging climate risk, and the desire of members to have an option that is free of all fossil fuel.
Okay. Um, when you talk about maybe the increased risk perception around fossil fuel stocks, there's sort of a business as usual assumption out there that prices will recover and the demand for fossil fuels is going to continue increasing into mid-century. Um, is part of your assessment that maybe that's a lot of happy talk from a fossil fuel point of view, but not very happy talk from a climate point of view, and climate is going to be the trump card?
If you look at the next few years, where we're going to go as a society in terms of addressing climate change, there seems to be a global consensus that we can't exceed a 2-degree increase in average global temperature, 2 degrees Celsius increase. That seems to be a pretty common starting point. Now, if we're going to achieve that level or stay within that threshold to avoid dangerous interference with the climate system, then according to the International Energy Agency, only 1/3 of proven reserves of fossil fuel can be consumed prior to 2050. What that means is that the two-thirds of what companies currently have on their books, fossil fuel companies, may not be utilized, which of course means there's a very significant risk to those assets. They become what's known as stranded assets. That's a term that came from the utility industry a few years ago during
Hmm.
deregulation, where people were talking about nuclear power and who was going to pay for these plants that everyone built, and they came up with this term stranded assets from accounting. And so, in a sense, you could see that happening within the fossil fuel industry when we get serious about climate change. And as a society, as an economy, we are going to get serious about climate change. It's not unavoidable at this point. We have to do something. We're starting to see financial instruments being developed across the country. Approximately 68% of Canada's economy will soon be under some form of carbon pricing. If you look at BC, Alberta, and Ontario, then there's going to be a price signal out there. One of the things that people have talked about at the IEA is that we can only use one third of fossil fuel, up to one third, if we don't implement carbon capture and storage. Okay, well, carbon capture and storage, the cost of carbon capture and storage is about $100 US per ton of CO2. That works out to anywhere between $35 and $55 per barrel of oil. So the amount of carbon dioxide in a barrel of oil, if you apply a control technology, it's going to cost you almost as much as the oil costs. That's the value of the CO2. So when you start talking about control cost, then you bring in something called substitution risk. Because if the real cost of controlling carbon dioxide is $50 per barrel of oil, then all of the other alternatives start to look a heck of a lot more economic. Whether it's DSM, demand side management, or renewable energy, or even lower carbon fuels like natural gas used in the right circumstances. So all of those things bring a lot more risk to the table to each individual company, and that's what we call company-specific risk. So each company within that sector has those risks. The other piece of risk is what we call systematic risk. I always want to say systemic, but it's actually
Yeah,
systemic.
yeah.
And that's the risk across the entire market. And make no mistake, climate change will have an impact on the entire market. It's going to impact the economies of many countries around the world. And as you get economic impacts, you start to get impacts that affect every company within your portfolio. And the question is, are you going to be invested in companies that have a really high beta, a high correlation to that market, where they start to move up and down in dramatic fashion in relation to the market? Or are you going to be invested in companies that are what we call the slow, boring companies that aren't quite as volatile?
So I guess another question coming out of that is whether this analysis positions renewable energy assets in particular as a form of diversification or risk management for investors.
Renewables definitely offer diversification benefits. Each portfolio, from our perspective, portfolio for a mutual fund for us, it's about 50 companies in each of our funds. So there's usually no more than 1.5 to 2.5% of each fund invested in each company. The more sectors you have, the broader your diversification, the more likely you are to avoid any missteps from each specific company. And what we've found in the last few years is that a number of the renewable energy companies that we've invested in are almost like utilities. They have long-term contracts with utilities. They've got a steady stream of revenue. They pay dividends. And as I said earlier, they're boring, and boring is good sometimes. You don't want to have an exciting portfolio where it's keeping you awake at night.
May you
So
live in interesting times, yeah.
exactly, exactly. And so renewables do bring diversification benefits to any portfolio. As long as the portfolio itself is diversified, because they're not, generally speaking, they're not correlated to oil and gas companies. You tend to see, I mean, at one point, natural gas and oil were much more closely related in terms of the volatility. But as we've seen utilities move away from using oil to generate electricity, the oil prices had much less of an effect on long-term renewables.
When you describe a utility stock that is stable and boring and has long-term contracts and pays dividends, it's almost as though you've just called OREC boring. And I hope that's the first time in ORIC's history that anyone said that, but in a good way. And I guess my question for you is how a local renewable energy co-op like ORIC, can benefit from the kind of risk environment you've described. And along the way, how can local investors benefit by involving themselves with ORIC?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on your co-op structure
Yeah.
as a vehicle, so I can't really speak to the the risks and rewards that might be associated with investing in the renewable energy co-op. But as a sector, we think it's going to be it has a lot of there's a lot of opportunity in the renewable energy sector that it's really up to each person to do their financial due diligence on each investment that they make. So I can't really comment on the structure itself, but we do believe that renewables have a very important place in both today and in the future in terms of offering a non-fossil fuel alternative to to investors.
Okay, and once again, some of the criteria that you've touched on in the course of this conversation, being free of that unburnable carbon risk that is attached to fossil fuel investments, long-term contracts, the demonstrated ability to pay a dividend based on those contracts. So, something nice, stable, and boring. And I'll just editorialize, you didn't say this, but doesn't hurt that it's something that helps build the local community's energy self-sufficiency and resilience along the way. Is that a fair
Oh, for
summary?
Yeah, that is a fair comment. I mean, when you get dispersed utility generation, it's generally from not just from the consumer's perspective, but from the utility's perspective, you reap a number of benefits. You have, you don't need as many high tension wires, for example, moving electricity across a countryside. You don't have those losses from transmission. Plus, if there are outages along the system, the more dispersed you are, then the more the more you're, the more stability is brought to the system through diverse, multiple generators, and you can see that with a renewable energy plant where you've got 30 different generation sources as opposed to one with a pipeline going into it.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, good luck with your process. I'm quite interested in renewable energy. I've been working on climate change since 1990. Uh, it's been a long and slow process, but despite the fact that we sometimes feel a bit cynical, a lot of progress has been made. I mean, when we started working on this, uh, the notion of a carbon tax, we wrote all kinds of papers on these ideas, but nobody was willing to actually take that first step. And now we believe we're at a good place where people are finally starting to realize we need to take some very serious action. And hopefully, coming up to the Paris conference, the next conference of the parties on Kyoto or on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that we'll see some really, really wonderful action coming out of that.
Okay, so a lot of ground to cover on climate and on the low carbon transition, but we've covered a lot of ground already, and you see that momentum building up.
Yes, definitely. There's definitely movement. We've had both the Prime Minister of France and Germany. They just met today, and we're talking. And since it is in Paris, France wants to see something come out of this, and they're talking about coming out with very substantial reduction targets. And in theory, uh, getting the G7 to agree to that. Now that includes Canada, so I won't hold my breath on what Canada will agree to, but it's good to see our provinces are taking a lot of action on climate.